Welcome to part 3 of this video. Some additional material has come across my field of view, so I'm adding on a part 3 to what was initially a 2-part series. Think about this quantitatively in terms of exponential technology. Internal combustion engines improve at 1 to 1.5% a year. Now, over decades, that's still substantial. In the 1980s, several TV shows portrayed the Corvette as the ultimate muscle car, and it was very glamorous and expensive and so forth. But as a muscle car, these 1980s Corvettes had only 240 horsepower and were probably 9 or 10 miles per gallon. And you can look up the specifications of a 1983 Corvette to verify those statistics. Today, not only does a Honda Civic have 180 horsepower, a Honda Accord has 252 horsepower. So more than the Corvettes of the 1980s, and the Corvettes of today are 600 to 700 horsepower. So the ratio of horsepower between various brands stays about the same, but the absolute floor rises a lot. And once again, in the 1980s, a 240 horsepower car maybe had 9 or 10 miles per gallon as a fuel economy, whereas today the 240 horsepower cars have 35 miles per gallon, even if they're internal combustion engines. But internal combustion engines improve at 1 to 1.5% a year. Electrical vehicles, by contrast, improve at 7 to 8% a year. And so while EVs were technologically uncompetitive, even as recently as 2012, 13, 14, 15, they are now quite competitive, as I will show you in that graph that I often show in these EV-related videos. Now, as I said earlier in parts 1 and 2, EVs are not the highest order disruption. The highest order disruption in terms of transportation and human interaction is in fact video conferencing, which improves at an even faster exponential rate of 10 to 15% a year. So EVs will still be somewhat of an interim technology, and yes, not all jobs can be done via video conferencing. A waiter, a doctor, a nurse, etc. have to go to their workplace, but when 30 to 60% of the workforce can be on video conferencing 50 to 90% of the time, that is very substantial, because this is a disruption that has diffused to over 100 million people almost instantaneously. That is why public transportation systems in major US cities are only at 33 to 50% of their pre-COVID usage, and that includes the Bay Area BART subway system, the New York City subway system, by far the largest in the United States, and the same is true in London and Tokyo and so forth. Now, back to EVs. I show this chart pretty often because this was from The Economist and enabled me to predict the rapid rise of EVs in my 2018 article in The Futurist. You can see here that while EVs were uncompetitive in 2008, the rise in both battery density as well as battery cost has caused a 40x improvement to occur in EVs. 40x. And that's why EVs pull ahead of internal combustion engines in all sorts of performance metrics, which was unthinkable in 2008. But that is how exponential technology works. And that is why those conservatives are still against EVs, because they cannot comprehend how quickly the technology has advanced, because they're generally opposed to exponential technologies, mainly because they're opposed to all change, whether they openly admit it or not. And immediately after I published my first 2 videos about how the National Review opposition to electrical vehicles proves that the technology is now mature, other conservative outlets have repeated the same points. Here's another Republican conservative outlet, Instapundit, which is also very closely tied to PJ Media, another conservative outlet. And there's a column at PJ Media written by Mark Tapscott, and let's go to that column. 3 huge reasons why electric vehicles will never dominate American roads. Now, they're already lowering expectations. They are tacitly admitting that EVs are permanently entrenched in Europe and Asia because they are over 25% of new car sales, but not in the US because Americans like to get in their car and drive 400 miles. But the premise here is that they do that every day. They don't. And of course, I'll first go to some of the points in this article, which are nothing new, exactly the same points as the National Review article. Again, I agree that there should not be a government ban on internal combustion engines. California has banned the sales of all new internal combustion engine vehicles after 2035. Bans like that should not occur, even though it's a relatively meaningless ban. Extremely few people will buy internal combustion engines in California in 2035. In fact, California is ground zero for that Zoom telework video conferencing revolution. But why make things harder for the last 5% or so that may still wish to buy an internal combustion engine? engine in California after 2035, especially when the whole premise of that is for climate change reasons. California is an extremely small part of the entire world, and last I checked, the whole world uses the same atmosphere. So that is more symbolic virtue signaling and so forth. But otherwise, Mark Tapscott makes the same errors of saying that the grid cannot support the load of EVs, which has been debunked many times, because if that was going to be a problem, it would already be a problem in East Asia and Europe, as well as that lithium and other mineral elements will run out. And those are the same arguments as the peak oil people used to say that oil was going to run out. And these same conservatives were screaming about peak oil a long time ago. And while, yes, the climate change movement has a lot of fraud and corruption in it, these conservatives get baited by that into throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, because they are now opposed to all technological change in that sense. And I know some of my viewers will say that's not true, conservatives don't oppose that. Well, they certainly are saying and acting like they do, because if you go back to Instapundit's link to this PJ Media article, just look at the comments underneath here. Here's one comment saying, I can get in my car and drive 450 miles in a day without fear of not being able to find gas or spending 40 to 60 minutes putting gas in my car. Okay, that's the corner case that happens very infrequently. Are you getting in your car to drive 450 miles a day often? Are you doing that every day? No mention whatsoever that fueling at your home is more convenient and the car is fully fueled every single day. You can also charge up at the office. New apartment complexes are being constructed that have outlets near where the car spaces are so that those cars can charge up. But this type of very memorized point is what these conservatives whip out because they're desperate to repeat the same things that they might have said in 2002. Remember, depending on the age of the conservative, it's always either 1979, if the conservative is old enough to remember 1979, or if younger, it's always 2002. These are the calendar years of peak conservatism, and they cannot advance their thinking beyond that in many cases. So the whole rebuttal against EVs is that you can get in your car and drive 450 miles in a single day. Charging at home is obviously not convenient, so debate via anecdote and extremely infrequent corner cases. I'll come back to this particular very weak point in a minute. But as you scroll down, you'll see other things. EVs won't take over until they come up with a far superior method than current battery technology to supply electricity to the motor. Didn't we just see that battery density chart? So yes, one could have said that before 2017 if they were not aware of the cost improvement of batteries, but now in 2022, this person's information is just entirely out of date. Again, that is one of the basic premises of conservatism. He hasn't kept up with the times. And you would think that if conservatives were extremely opposed to EVs, they would be very pro-fracking, but they aren't. They're modestly in favor of fracking, but remember, having domestic oil means it's harder to have more wars in the Middle East, under which the premise is for securing oil supply. So that's why their support of hydraulic fracturing is lukewarm. But now back to this point about you can get in your car and drive 450 miles a day, and somehow that is more valuable than being able to fully charge up overnight every single day so that the car is fully fueled every morning. Well, if you're going to debate via anecdote, then I can defeat your argument via anecdote as well. Now, race car sports are very gasoline-oriented, and these conservatives like to say that NASCAR and Indy 500 and so forth are part of the fabric of American society. That may be true. There's also car racing in Europe in places like Monte Carlo and so forth. But an outstanding young man was tragically murdered for no reason. NASCAR driver Bobby East was stabbed to death at a gas station while he was filling up his normal car. Now, if you're familiar with how criminals think and how criminals identify victims, a person fueling at a gas station has always been considered an easy target for criminals because the person's focus is on the pump, the criminal can sneak up on them from behind, and so forth. And this wasn't even a robbery, it was just a mindless murder. So this outstanding young man was murdered when he was 37 years old, and this was the murderer, a degenerate, one of the lowest of the low human beings. If Bobby East, in his personal life, had an electric vehicle that he charged at home, he wouldn't have been at that gas station at that time. And remember, in his professional life, he's a NASCAR driver on those NASCAR tracks. But fueling at a gas station led to this murder. Now, conservatives are so adept at creating logical pretzels and contradicting themselves that I wouldn't put it past a conservative to say, well, getting murdered at a gas station is part of American life and it's the fabric of our society and it's the American way. So if you want to debate via corner case anecdotes, then I can do that too. If Bobby was not at a gas station, he would not be dead today. And as a rule, when someone is debating via anecdote, that means they know they have lost the debate because they cannot present data to support their position, or they're not smart enough to debate via data. Either way, you win. But keep these numbers in mind to see the unfolding of exponential trends and how a certain trend might overtake another because the newer trend is faster moving, and therefore the outperformance happens at a rate that may surprise people who don't understand exponential rates of change, but is very predictable by someone who is keeping an eye on the quantitative rate of growth. So this is the end of part 3 of this video series, a part that I added as an afterthought. But if you like this type of content, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much for watching.